What's required for science to explain consciousness? In this episode, we'll be looking at a simple way of understanding why science has problems explaining consciousness. We're going to be using a simple circle of explanation to find out what sort of problems science comes up against. The theory is simple. Step 1. We start with what we know. Step 2. We apply our method of investigation to what we know. Step 3. We develop an understanding of the phenomena. Step 4. We use our understanding that we've created to reconstruct what we knew in the beginning from our theory, to prove our ideas to be correct. So, we'll begin. Welcome to Consciousness Matters. What's required for science to explain consciousness? Conscious perception. Rene Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." However, I've noticed during meditation that I can have periods of not thinking, and I still exist. So I'd like to refine that idea by saying, "I experience, therefore I am." This is the only logical place to start because I could be confused or fooled into all sorts of delusions, but the fact that I exist experiencing them is always indisputable to me. It is the most logical place to begin skeptical inquiry from. The only thing that I can be certain of. Science. We hypothesize, and we experiment to test our hypothesis. We draw experimental conclusions, and then we submit them for peer review. We hopefully get our results replicated, and if that's the case, and enough results are collected, we'll have a meta-analysis where we look at all the results together, and we see if we can draw a conclusion about the hypothesis that the community can agree on. It's the best process we know for figuring out how the world we share works and predicting its behaviour. It's allowed us to achieve the technological society that we take for granted today. Science is based on empirical observations, things we can see for ourselves in our own experience. Empirical observations are, of course, conscious perceptions. Scientific reductionism. In the theory of reductionism, we put forward the idea that the world we experience is built up from irreducible parts. We use science to try and work out what these parts are. We've gone from thinking that atoms are fundamental to subatomic particles, to using particle colliders to observe that even subatomic particles are made of yet smaller parts. For example, protons and neutrons are made of quarks. That's how we get the standard model of particle physics, which is the graphic for this section. It may be that quantum field theory displaces the standard model as being fundamental. However, that doesn't matter. We're still trying to build the world out of irreducible parts either way. We're trying to suggest that the world is constituted completely from these building blocks and how they behave. So, we can take the world apart, but can we put it back together again? The hard problem of consciousness. So long as we don't have to model a conscious perceiver and limit ourselves to only conscious perceptions of the world, then things may still appear to work fine. I'll elaborate on what I mean here. Photons entering your eyes, hitting your retina and sending a signal to your brain are things we can understand reasonably using our circle of explanation so far. But the moment that we talk about the experience of the colour red, our circle of explanation fails. Here is the point where our circle of explanation breaks down. We have accounted for what we consciously perceive to a large extent, but not for why we consciously perceive it, not for conscious perceptions in and of themselves. Why is it that this extraordinary machine of physics, chemistry and biology should be accompanied by subjective experience? Why does it feel like something to be us? This has been popularised by philosopher David Chalmers as the hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers features on the graphic for this section. When we think of what's required for science to explain consciousness, this is where science gets stuck. It's also known as the explanatory gap. Here is where we realise our circle of explanation has failed to get back what we started with. We might want to stop and take another look. When we look closely, what we see is that we're trying to build ourselves out of our conscious perceptions of the world. This isn't the only way that we could try understanding things, however. This isn't the only approach we could use. So it's only fair to ask the question, is this the best approach? And what we're really doing is asking ourselves something. We're asking ourselves, can we build ourselves out of our perceptions of the world? This is an open question, and one worth asking and considering without prejudice. We could say yes. We could advocate for continuing our approach with a promissory note. We could say that reductionism has led to so much understanding and technological advancement that it has explained so much that it has to work for consciousness as well. With more neuroscience and more time and money invested in the problem, we will find something that clinches it. This is what will be required for science to explain consciousness. This is the approach of physicalism, materialism, and illusionism. If you want to advocate for that position, there are some problems you have to face. The meta-problem of consciousness. Why are we talking about consciousness? In the approach of physicalism or materialism, because the conscious perceiver is not viewed as fundamental, it must emerge, or it must be an illusion, as in not really present, like a mirage in a desert.
What I wonder, Richard, is whether there really is no such thing as consciousness at all, and that there's some other understanding of the functioning of the human brain that renders that question obsolete.
In illusionism, to answer the meta-problem, we need to find a mechanistic explanation of how and why we go round talking about consciousness when it's not real in the way that we think it is.
We should say, though, that aside from eliminativism and illusionism, there is this kind of emergent position that one can take.
In emergence or epiphenomenalism, to answer the meta-problem, we need to explain how and why we have consciousness. And, this is a really important and, how and why we go around talking about consciousness. Now watch out, because two odd things happened there. Not only did consciousness emerge, but it emerged and then self-reported its existence by physical means. If the ramifications of that make your head spin, don't worry, you're not alone. Weak emergence doesn't explain conscious experience. Generally speaking, informed people happily accept the idea of complex behaviour arising from simple behaviour. This means wetness from water, complex ant colony behaviour arising from simple behaviours of individual ants. That sort of thing. This is weak emergence. Conceivably, weak emergence grants you a brain with complex behaviour, but it doesn't grant you that subjective experience described in the hard problem of consciousness. In a universe we assume to have an unconscious base, as if we didn't assume that, we'd be panpsychists, we have to somehow conjure up consciousness, subjective experience. Weak emergence doesn't allow for that. It doesn't work. So we have to move to strong emergence. Strong emergence of conscious experience is magic. Strong emergence is the idea that complex enough behaviour can create the existence of something truly new, like conscious experience out of a previously unconscious machine. It's just what we need as a physicalist or a materialist if we reject illusionism. With the right complexity or right conditions, we can suggest that consciousness starts to exist. In physicalism, we typically seek to reduce any force acting on the world into fundamental components that have always been with the cosmos. Earlier on, we mentioned that consciousness didn't only have to emerge, but it had to self-report by physical means for us to be talking about it. Now, this sort of meta-analysis, stepping back and looking on the situation, is often confusing for people, so I'm going to try and make things easier by telling you that there are two possible things going on here. And I invite you to think about this. Consider it in your spare time, because I really think that I've got something here that's game-changing in the way that we look at consciousness, scientifically speaking. Possibility 1. Conversations we have about consciousness are only the result of particles in motion, following the laws of physics. This means that the reason we talk about consciousness isn't because it's a genuine, causal and unexplained phenomenon, but rather that it's due to physical brains naturally doing what physical brains do, following physical laws and physical processes. There's nothing extraordinary going on. Notice that this view makes us illusionists. Claims of consciousness are just the behaviour of confused brains, and we know this because the claims come from physical processes. They can be accounted for. Okay, now the other possibility. Possibility 2. Conversations we have about consciousness are caused by consciousness. This means that the reason that we talk about consciousness is because somehow consciousness is able to manipulate our brains, to have a conversation about consciousness. Note that if consciousness is interfering or interacting with physical things, that makes it a force in the world. So, we have a new conscious force that springs into being via completely unknown processes and for no apparent reason. And we have that if we want to keep up this idea of consciousness as emergent. Now, I really want you to imagine what that would sound like in a classroom. In physics, there are, as you can see, 4 fundamental forces or interactions that form the basis of all known interactions in nature. The one exception to this is the consciousness force, which, unlike all the others, was completely absent for billions of years in the universe, then suddenly popped into existence with brains. It's an appeal to magical thinking or miracles, and if we're going to be happy with that, if we're going to accept that, then we really should be more open-minded to other magic and miracles. Why shouldn't walking on water be a strongly emergent property of Jesus? Why shouldn't levitation be a strongly emergent property of Buddha? After all, consciousness is a strongly emergent property of the brain. Consciousness isn't real, or it's magic, but we shouldn't let that get in the way. We must carry on despite these problems, or we might see these problems as so serious that we need to take a step back and take another look at the question. Is this the best approach? Can we build ourselves out of our perceptions of the world? We could say no. Doing anything else would be better than the intellectual dead end we have reached with our previous approach. Solutions. In our focus to understand conscious perception, we neglected the conscious perceiver. We're going to argue that science can only explain consciousness when it models the conscious perceiver in addition to conscious perception. That we need to integrate both aspects of consciousness to solve the problem. This is the approach of the following non-exhaustive list of solutions. Panpsychism. Panpsychism literally means mind throughout. It's actually a very broad term, but it is usually used to refer to constitutive panpsychism or micropsychism, which is what we'll use the word for as we go forwards in this episode. In panpsychism, we believe or hypothesize that all fundamentals we find in our reductionist view of the world contain an element of mind, regardless of our own ability, or lack thereof, to imagine what it might feel like to be a quark or an electron. The challenge for panpsychism is to explain how all these tiny bits of mind combine to form something like human consciousness, which is known as the combination problem. Solve that problem, and we could complete the circle of explanation, providing we don't have to think too hard about consciousness also having causal power. Idealism. Idealism can be talked about as a form of panpsychism, known as cosmopsychism, but we will use the old word idealism for the rest of this episode. In idealism, we believe or hypothesize that there is one cosmic mind within which all time, space, and conscious perceptions exist. There is one subject. There is one conscious perceiver, and separation is an illusion created by dissociation from this larger mind. Yeah, I mean, that means the conscious perceiver that's having the experience of being me right now is the same conscious perceiver that has the experience of being you. That's really hard to get your head around. I mean, you can start suggesting stories and metaphors at this point. You can start saying things like, well, you know, it's sort of like, imagine that you reincarnate, but you don't reincarnate to further on in time. You reincarnate to be someone else in this lifetime, and somehow that all meshes together. It's very difficult for people to get their heads around this. I appreciate that. The outer world, in this view, is a shared reality underwritten by the mind of the universe. The challenges with idealism are in explaining how this dissociation works, sort of an opposite version of the combination problem for panpsychists. Solve these problems and we can complete the circle of explanation. Conscious realism. Conscious realism is the idea that the world is a network of conscious agents. It's the idea that from lower level conscious agents, we can build up higher level conscious agents. In some sense, this resolves the combination and dissociation problems of panpsychism and idealism respectively. Conscious realism, as proposed by Donald Hoffman, also builds mathematical models for conscious agents in an effort to be as precise as possible about the claims that it makes. Hoffman makes it clear that the theory needs to recover or get back things like quantum mechanics from these conscious agents interacting, to which Hoffman says that it does.
To solve the mind-body problem, I can assume that physics is fundamental, and then my burden is to get consciousness. Or, what I'm trying to do is the opposite. I assume consciousness is fundamental. Then my burden is to show that all of physics comes out of it. Quantum mechanics and so forth comes out of this. And it does.
It leaves room for the causal power of consciousness to express via free will, but doesn't offer a comprehensive explanation for how this works. It's probably important that we should take a step back and remind ourselves of the problem. What's required for science to explain consciousness, and why is it presently failing to do so? When we try to build ourselves, our consciousness out of our conscious perceptions of the world, our circle of explanation fails. We can take the world apart, but it doesn't go back together again properly. It's only fair that when this occurs, that we ask ourselves the question, can we build ourselves out of our perceptions of the world? It's the answer to this question which will determine what we need to do next.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
Consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.